Welcome to another video. Today we will be going over the Jobava London, which has been recommended by many famous players like Hans Niemann, Alex Bansier, Naroditsky, Simon Williams, a lot of different strong players. It goes as follows: pawn to d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, intending to push now e4. We will prevent this by playing pawn to d5. White will play bishop to f4, and this is the symbol of the Jobava London. White is playing with ideas of putting the knight on b5. For example, a grave error for black would play knight c6, after where white will play knight b5, hitting the pawn on c7, and black is in a lot of trouble. For this reason, I will recommend to play pawn to a6. This is a very nice idea, because you will stop the knight going from to b5. Also, later we can play pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side. Here, if white plays a move like a4, intending to prevent the push of b5, we have earned a lot of potential in our position by including these moves. For example, after pawn to c5 and pawn e3, knight c6, we no longer have to worry about knight going to b5 or the bishop going to b5, and this is a great achievement for us. After c5, white can also try to take the pawn, but we will play pawn to e6, intending to take the pawn on c5. If white plays a move like b4, we can now play b6. And if white takes this move, takes this pawn, we can now take bishop takes b4, and white is in a lot of trouble. So a4 is not to be recommended. Instead, also some white players have tried to play f3. The idea being that you want to expand in the center with pawn to e4. Now it's very important that we challenge the white center with pawn to c5. And now if white continues the plan, playing pawn to e4, we are simply in time to take on d4. If he takes queen d4, we play knight to c6, hitting the queen on d4. And again, you see how useful this little move a6 is. If he could play a move like bishop b5, it would be quite annoying to pin our knight. But now it's simply impossible because a6 b5 and black is winning. There has been some ideas here for white. For example, white can put the queen on a4, but I found out that white is losing here after actually two different moves. One way is to play pawn to d4, and if white long castle, the idea being if we take the knight, he can now take our queen with a winning position for white. We can play here knight d7, blocking this rook, and the knight is in trouble here. This is at least much better for black. Also, we can play a move like bishop d7. This is even more fancy. It happens as if he takes on d5, can now play pawn to b5, hitting the queen on a4, making a lot of trouble for white. For example, if he now takes on b5, we simply capture, hitting the queen with the rook, and we are winning. For this reason, to push e4 this early is no good for white. Instead, he could also try to take the pawn on c5, after where we'll play e6, hitting the pawn on c5 with the bishop. White can try to support the pawn with a move like b4, but then we will simply play b6. The idea again being if he takes, we will take bishop takes b4 with a deadly pin on the king on e1 and the knight on c3. So f3 is also not the best way for white to play. Also, a lot of players have tried to play queen d2. The idea is to castle long and trying to start some things in the center, maybe at some point f3 e4. But here we will push b5, and after long castling we'll play pawn to e6, and we will continue with the following setup: knight on d7, the bishop on b7, the bishop on e7, and pushing c5. All these moves can actually be played in different orders. Nonetheless, black is doing great here. A sample line could be knight to f3. We'll play knight bd7. White will play knight e5. We can now put the bishop on b7. And I highlighted some of the plans. We want to put the bishop on e7 and castle the king, but also to expand on the queen side with our pawns with like c5, b4, a5, and black has a great game. The reason is that the king on c1 will become weak at a later stage. So queen d2 is not the best. Instead, white can try a move like queen d3, actually not only having the idea of long castle in mind, but also to push pawn to e4. Here it's important that we don't play b5, because if we do, he will play pawn to e4, and white is doing well in the center. After queen d3, we will again challenge the center with pawn to c5. And now if he plays a move like e4, we get into a very similar situation as against f3 in move 4. We will now take on d4, queen takes d4, and again after knight c6, we find it very useful that we have the pawn on a6, stopping any kind of bishop b5. So after pawn to c5, white can also try a move like e3, but then we'll play e6, and we will continue with the piece placement as before, the knight on d7, pawn on b5, the bishop on b7, and all is good. So after c5, again white can try to take. This time we'll actually play knight c6 with the ideas of playing maybe e5 or e6. White can play knight f3. We will play e6, again intending to recapture the pawn on c5. Now it's not possible for white to defend the pawn like this, because we can simply take this pawn, hidden queen, and black is winning. So after e6, white can try to play e4, the plan showed just before. Now we'll play pawn to d4, hitting the knight on c3, intending bishop takes c5. For example, if he now castles the king, this is not possible because we can take pawn takes c3, and after he takes our queen, we can recapture with the knight, and we are a piece ahead. For this reason, white can now try to play knight e2, hitting the pawn on d4. We will take this pawn on c5, and white can long castle, putting pressure on d4. Now we'll play a bit of a mysterious move, but a strong one nonetheless, playing knight to h5. And actually this makes a lot of sense once you thought a bit more about it. The idea is to take the bishop on f4. If he puts the bishop back on d2, we will play pawn to e5, solidifying the center on d4. Instead, white can also try to play bishop to g5, then we'll put the queen on a5, hitting the pawn on a2. And if white were to take this pawn on d4, we can take with the bishop, he will take with the knight, and we have queen takes g5, check. Black winning the game because we are now a piece up. So this was queen d3, then it's important to play c5, whereas against queen d2, we will play pawn to b5, and continuing with the setup of e6. This was some of the queen moves. Let's now turn to the alternatives, which is knight to f3, one of the main moves. Now we'll play pawn to e6. b5 is also possible, but I like e6 even more because it gives us some more options of playing pawn to c5 and even bishop b4 in some rare cases. If white were now to stop bishop b4 with a move like a3, we can play pawn to c5, pawn goes to e3, and we'll play b5. Again, we'll put the pieces on the squares as before, bishop on b7, bishop on e7, knight on d7. So a3 is not to be recommended. Instead, white can try and move, let's say, queen d3. We will again play pawn to, not again, but this time we'll play pawn to b5. Because white is actually not really in time. Because if he plays pawn to e4, we will now play b4, hitting the knight on c3. If he now moves the attack knight, for example to a4, can now take d takes e4, hitting the queen, hitting the knight on f3, and black is winning. So after b4, if white plays a move like e5, giving us a bit of our own medicine, hitting our knight on f6, we can now take his knight, he will take our knight, take the pawn on b2, hitting the rook on a1. It's not possible for white to take on g7, because we will take the rook on a1, creating a queen with a check. Queen is hitting the king on e1. If white plays a move like rook to b1, intending to grab the pawn next, we will take the pawn on f6 with the queen, hitting the bishop, and black is better. So after e6, the main move for white is to play pawn to e3, and here we will play pawn to c5, and this is actually very important timing. Let me show you why. If white now plays the bishop to d3, we are in time to play pawn to c4, and he can now not retreat the bishop to c2. He has to go to e2, after where I can play pawn to b5, and I have a very strong pawn center, and also pawn storm on the queen side. The pawn on c4 is taking up a lot of space. So after c5, it's no longer possible for white to play bishop to d3. If he plays a move like bishop e2, we'll play pawn to b5, again putting the pieces on the squares as I told, bishop on b7, bishop on e7, and knight on d7. So after c5, if white plays a move like pawn takes c5, we'll recapture with the bishop. Now he can put the bishop on d3, because we can no longer play c5 to c4, because he took the pawn. Can now play a bit of a fancy move. Also castling here is alright for black, no problem. But to be a bit more precise, black can even play knight bd7. And black actually has a very cool idea here. If white now plays the move pawn to e4, we can take if we want, but we can play an even cooler move, pawn to e5. The idea being, if he now takes this pawn, we will take back with the knight. He will take the bishop. We now have bishop takes f2. And if he recaptures with the king, we have knight g4 check, hitting the king, hitting the bishop on e5, and black is doing excellent here. For this reason, it's not advisable for white to take this pawn. He can instead play a move like bishop g5, but after queen b6, hitting the pawn on f2, white will castle, protecting the pawn. We can take on e4, and after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, we will castle our king, and black is doing fine here. We are putting pressure on f2, and we are not getting checkmated. So this was just to illustrate what's happening after move 4, knight f3. Let's now turn to the main line. That is pawn to e3. This is the most flexible for white, because now he has not put the knight on f3 yet. Sometimes it can also go to e2. So after e3, we will play the move pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side. Now it's very important to note, if he plays the move pawn to a4, we will not take this pawn. Then he will take rook takes a4, and we have a weak pawn on a6. This we don't want to allow. So after a4, we almost always play pawn to b4, hitting the knight on c3, and continuing our advance on the queen side. If he were to play a move like a3, stopping our pawn to b4, because if we play pawn b4, he can now take the pawn, and we're pawn down. We will play the move pawn to e6, again intending at some point to play pawn to c5. For example, knight f3, we'll play c5, and all is good. If white were to play a move like b4 to stop c5, now c5 is no longer possible, because he will take on c5, and white is winning, being a very strong pawn up here. So here we'll play instead knight bd7, and next few moves we'll put the bishop on b7, the bishop on d6, and all is good. So after e6, white also has a very aggressive move here, that is to play g4. And now it gets very complicated. I advise you to check out the analysis I put on Lichess, but then black can play b4. White will take the bishop, and actually already knowing until here is a great start, but black has some ideas of knight to e4, but I advise you to check out the analysis on Lichess for this line. Instead, after b5, white can also try to play the bishop to d3, but then we will simply play pawn to e6, again putting the pieces on the same squares, intending at some point pawn to c5. Let's now look at a bit of computer's way of playing, which has gotten popular by quite some players, trying to expand on the king side with h4. The idea is usually to push pawn to g4 and g5, hitting the knight on f6. But we are not scared of this. We will play pawn to e6. If now white plays a move like h5, going for h6 next move, we can simply stop his expansion by playing our pawn to h6, and all is good. One line could be pawn to g4, going for g5, we'll play bishop out. If he continues g5, we'll now take the pawn, bishop takes, and play bishop to e7. Note very importantly that the knight is still very well placed on f6, and white didn't manage to push it away. So after pawn to g4, we will now counter his knight by playing pawn to b4, hitting the knight on c3. If he plays a move like knight b1, we have a very cool tactic here. Not needed, but very cool. So we will now take this pawn on g4. If he takes back with the queen, it looks like, okay, we just lost the piece. What do we do? But we have the very cool move e5. Hitting the queen on g4, hitting the bishop on f4, and after moves like queen g3, we'll take the bishop, he will take with the queen. Black is doing great here because of the bishop pair. Can play a move like bishop d6, hitting the queen, and all is good. So knight b1 is not to be recommended. A more active move would be to play knight to a4. Here it's also possible, of course, to take and play e5, but the knight is better placed on a4. So here I actually recommend to play bishop to d6, challenging the bishop on f4, at some point aiming to trade. For example, one line is pawn to g5. We will take the bishop. If he takes our knight, we'll retreat with the bishop to d6. If he takes the pawn, we'll play rook to g8, and the next move we will recapture the pawn on g7, again with a great game because of the bishop pair. So after bishop takes f4, white can recapture, e takes f4, and we'll put the knight on e4, and the game is very complicated here. White has a strange knight on a4, we have a strong knight on e4, but maybe he will try to attack the knight with a move like bishop g2, and also this knight can get into danger. Maybe we'll play a move like knight d7, but the game is very complicated here and a lot of things can happen. Also sometimes we can retreat the knight to d6, aiming for the f5 square. But anyways, this was h4, leads to very complicated play, but black is not worse there. Let's now turn to the main line, which is white playing knight to f3, just developing the pieces. After this we will play pawn to e6, again having options of playing c5 or bishop b4 and just developing in general. So let's say if he plays a move like bishop e7, bishop e2, we will play bishop to b7, and the bishop is actually not so well placed here on e2. It would much rather be on d3. So after e6, white will play bishop d3, the active square for the bishop. Here I will recommend to play bishop to b7. Note that black also has other interesting moves here, like c5 or knight b d7. I put some note on leeches of these lines, but I would recommend bishop b7, especially because there is a very nice trick here. If white castles the king, is a very clear mistake, because then black will play c5. Now white is not in time to move this knight and play c3. So the next move, we're threatening to play c4. For example, if he plays knight e2, would be a grave error, because we'll play c4, and the bishop is simply trapped, leading to black winning the game. So after c5, white is more or less forced to take this pawn on c5, because if he moves the knight back to b1, we will play c4, again having a great queenside expansion. So after c5 takes, bishop takes, we are again doing better, because we have the very nice central pawn on d5. We'll put the knight on d7 and we'll castle our king with a great game. For this reason, white should really move his knight here. One square could be to play it to b1, but then we'll play c5. White will play c3, and we'll play knight b d7, and we'll have ideas of playing bishop e7, castling our king, and going to e4 with the knight. Note that it is no longer a good idea to play pawn to c4, now that the bishop can retreat via c2. And now actually white is doing fine here, because he is coming with knight b d2, queen e2, and pushing e4 eventually. So black should play knight b d7 and simply aim to castle the king. But this is not the main line. The main line is playing knight e2. The idea is that the knight is simply more active here than it is on b1. After knight e2, black will continue c5, white will play c3, again having the option to retreat the bishop. We will develop the knight to d7. Note that we shouldn't develop the knight to c6. Here it's awfully placed, blocking our own bishop on b7. Knight d7, and here white could, for example, castle his king. We will play bishop to e7. White could develop the knight from e2 to g3, aiming to put all his pieces on the king side. But we are not afraid. We will simply castle our king. We don't see any immediate danger. The Greek gift sacrifices nothing here, because we can simply recapture with the knight, and the king is in a great shape. Play could continue like knight goes to e5. We will take the knight. If he takes with the bishop, we can even play a move like g6, and the next move maybe knight d7. In general, black is doing perfectly fine here. Also, we can play the knight to e4. There is simply no trouble here. For this reason, white can try to take with the pawn on e5, but this will also create a double pawn for white, where we'll play knight d7. If white now plays a move like queen to h5, we are in time with g6, and there is no immediate mate on h7. If he plays a move like queen h6, we are in time to move our rook, because right now white is threatening actually to play knight h5. Let me just make a random move. Let's say a5, knight h5, and he's coming with checkmate here on g7. If we take the knight, he will checkmate us on h7, leading to a loss. For this reason, we have to move our rook here to e8, and next move we'll play bishop f8, going to g7, and black is doing wonderfully, because knight h5, we're just in time to play bishop f8, and white is losing, because he can no longer play queen g7. And if he moves the queen to g5, we can trade the queens and take the knight. And we are a piece up in the endgame. So after knight d7, white can also try a move like queen to g4, looking to play knight h5 or to play bishop h6. Here we can also play pawn to g5, g6. Very importantly, not g5, g6. Again, restricting the bishop here. Next move we'll play king h8, and we have ideas like queen c7, putting pressure on the e5 pawn. And as long as black is not getting mated, he's doing wonderful here. So after castling short, white could also try a move like queen e2, but then we'll play knight e4, blocking the game. And it is not possible for white to take this one with the knight, because then we'll take back and hitting the bishop on d3, the knight on f3, and there is a simple, very strong fork here, winning the game. So actually, castling is not the most dangerous option here. White can instead try to play knight g3, delaying castling a bit. And after bishop e7, trying to play something like h4, trying to activate the rook at some point. And when white is delaying the castling, I would also try to delay it for black. Because once white castles, we can also follow him and all is fine. So here I would play a move like pawn to b4, going for some attack on the queen side. For example, if he takes this pawn, this cannot be recommended, because we can even play c takes d4, coming to take on b4, and black is doing great here. So for this reason, if white now castles, we can also castle, follow him, and everything is fine. But white could try a move like knight e5. We will again take this knight. Knight takes e5. If he takes with the bishop, there's no problem. He doesn't attack our knight on f6. Everything is fine. But he can also try to take on e5 with the pawn. Then we'll play knight d7. Now white also has a lot of weaknesses on e5 and h4. If white plays a move like knight h5, we can simply play g6. It's not so scary if he goes to g7. We'll simply move the king to f8. We move the bishop to h6, intending to take knight takes e6, going for some forks. We can move our king to g8, and this knight on g7 is going to be trapped. If instead he retreats to g3 with the knight, black is simply doing much better here because of the weak pawns here. Okay, so that was that. And let's now take a short look at what happens if white castles here. Here I'd recommend not to follow him actually, because we can try a move like g6, just a prophylactic move. And now we're hitting the pawn on h4, the pawn on e5, and white has some questions to solve. For example, now if he plays the move h5, trying to attack the g6 pawn, we will trap the bishop with pawn to g6 to g5. And the bishop has no squares, and if he takes on g5, we will take back, being a bishop up, and white black is winning. So after g6, the game can continue here, something like e4. The game is very complicated. We can, for example, take a pawn on h4. It's one option, but also there are other moves. But I just wanted to make it until here, because black is definitely doing fine here. So that was it for the video. I'll just quickly resume some of the most important points. If the queen goes to d2, and if he goes for long castle, we can play b5, and after long castling e6, the king will be in trouble here on the queen side. If he plays for f3, we will counter in the center with c5. If he plays a move like queen d3, going for e4, we'll play c5, again challenging the center. And after knight f3, we'll play e6, intending to play c5 quickly. And the main line goes e3, we will play b5. And just remember this setup with the bishop on b7, the knight on d7, the pawn on c5, and the bishop on e7. And then you are good to go. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope it has been useful and that you will crush the Jobava London in the future. See you around.